Good evening and welcome to the October 23rd regular meeting of the Edina School Board. I am calling the meeting to order and we do have a quorum. I am sitting in for Leny tonight, who is on a business trip and couldn't be with us, so I will be chairing the meeting this evening. First item on the agenda is approval of the minutes. We had a work session on September 25th, a regular meeting on September 25th, another work session on October 2nd, and again on October 9th. Could I get a motion to approve the minutes? Are there any changes to the minutes? Thank you, thank you. So any changes to the minutes? All right, seeing none, all those in favor of approving the minutes, say aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. All right, Dr. Schultz, could you give us a brief overview of this evening's agenda?
Yeah, so we will approve the minutes, as you already have done. We have recognition of the Edina Public Schools Orchestra team, chance to hear from audience members. You have some consent items, pretty routine consent items. Reports and discussion. I said this is the Margot Balk show because, Margot Balk's a common denominator. District financial audit, enrollment projections, class size, facilities report. Well, Randy's on too for the show. Curriculum review process and policy review. And action tonight, again on the audit, you'll be approving district medical insurance renewal, school board communications and community engagement, and my goals for the year. So that's the agenda for tonight.
All right, thank you, Dr. Schultz. Regina.
Yes, thank you. So I would like to request a change to the agenda for the action item C on school board communications and community engagement. Actually does not require any action, so I propose that we do section 6, reports and discussions, and review.
Excellent, thank you. And I don't believe we need a motion to amend the agenda, or do we? We do. All right, could I get a motion? Thank you. All those in favor of removing the item C under action and adding it as an item E under reports and discussion, say aye. Opposed? All right, motion carried. Thank you, Regina, for doing that for us. All right. First up, we have a recognition that we'd like to ask the orchestra team to come up to be recognized.
Where are your instruments?
Thank you. On Saturday, we were awarded the 2017 Meritorious Orchestra Program Award from the Minnesota String and Orchestra Teachers Association, and it's actually an award for the entire Edina Public School Orchestra program. So, yes.
All right. And who are you?
Oh, yes. So,
I'll do the tough part now.
Sounds good. Well, my name is Nick Gaudetz, and I'm the high school orchestra director. I started last year here at Edina, so I'm in my second year. And yeah.
And what exactly do you teach or lead with the orchestra? What part of the orchestra?
Sure. I do 3 different orchestras. Concert orchestra, which is our top tier level orchestra, varsity orchestra, and sinfonia as well. So we do everything from string works to full symphonic music, and yeah, it's absolutely fabulous.
And you are?
And I'm Kirsten Darby.
Okay. And what do you teach?
Yep, and I teach the 5th grade orchestra students. So I teach at all of the elementary schools, traveling throughout the week, and that's our beginner level, so teaching all the beginners in the district.
And you?
I'm Dan Mollick, and I teach at Valley View Middle School, 6th through 8th grade orchestra.
So I just want one question, just one really easy question. What's your favorite piece to play with students? Oh, you have it?
Oh, I've got one.
All right. Yeah. Well, there's 2. Medieval Wars. Yeah, it's called Medieval Wars. They love it. It's so fun. And the second one we play sort of in the spring. It's called Dos Fuegos, which is called Two Fires. So it's actually written by the husband of Barb Flooding, who was the teacher here in Edina at Valley View for like 20 years. So fun connection.
Very cool.
Yeah.
I would say my students really love doing rock songs. So we usually do "We Will Rock You" every year, and the kids really like learning that one. Yep.
There's a piece called "American Salute" by Morton Gold, and it's actually the theme of when Johnny comes marching home. So, or when the ants go marching 2 by 2. So, yeah.
Well, it's really an honor to be recognized, and I hope you all celebrate this. And Vice Chair Patzloff has got some certificates to give you.
All right, next on our agenda is hearings from members of the audience. And Sarah, do I have just the one? As you know, as a board, we welcome input from the audience. At these meetings, though, we do follow policy 206, asking the members who are addressing the board to stick to their 3-minute time allotment and to make sure that we follow policy in that we are not addressing particular members of the Edina staff, the board, or parents or children in our community. And we have one speaker this evening, and that is Mr. Tim O'Neill. Come on up.
Thank you. And I'll actually be brief tonight. I won't even take the full 3 minutes. My name is Tim O'Neill, and my wife and I have 3 kids at Concord, soon to be 4 next fall. My wife and I both wanted to thank Mary Manderfeld and Margot Bach for putting this report together tonight. It's, I think, 19 pages, and I'm sure that it'll be discussed tonight, but one thing that jumped out at me, and I'm a very untrained mathematical eye, so I'm sure it'll be discussed, but on page 17, actually on page 18, Normandale currently has projected of 647 students, and it says that the district functional capacity is 621 students. So it looks to my untrained eye that Normandale is functioning over capacity. And then what brought to my attention was that Concord, for the next school year, is projected to be 752 students, which is over their district functional capacity. And then furthermore, in 4 years, 4 of our 6 elementary schools look like they'll be functioning over capacity. But maybe I'm not reading it correctly, and I'm sure it'll be discussed tonight. So that was the only question that we had. So thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Yes, in regard to the topic that you just brought up, we are having a report on enrollment this evening. And otherwise, though, if your questions aren't directly addressed this evening, somebody will follow up with you. So thank you, Tim. All right, next up is the consent agenda. Are there any requests to remove anything from the consent agenda? All right, hearing none, could I get a motion to approve the consent agenda?
So, second.
All right, all those in favor of approving the consent agenda, say aye.
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 Opposed? Motion carried. All right, moving on to reports and discussions. You are up first and apparently not last, Margot, for our report on the district financial audit for 2016-17. And you have a guest, Margot?
Yes. Good evening, Superintendent Schultz and School Board. I have with me tonight Bill Lauer from MMKR, the district's audit firm. We have completed our audit process, I'm happy to report, and that process starts it's throughout the year, but starts in June, and we work diligently as a business office team and others involved within the district, as well as Bill's team, to complete the audit. There's many hours of work and at least 2 solid weeks of them being on site. I will say that this year we proceeded very well through the audit. We had new staff, but we had new learnings, and we continued to partner and move through the audit and get things done on time. One area, as you would expect, we had a lot of construction this summer, and the fiscal year, I just note that the fiscal year is June 30th, and construction is usually by summer or project. And that really, as expected, created additional work, particularly with this summer, not only for our team, but Bill's team as well. But we got through that within the systems that we both have, and it came out really well. There were some Governmental Accounting Standard Board changes, and Bill will go through that, but I am happy to report the unassigned fund balance came within projections of where we had projected. And we did review, and Bill and Jackie came to the Finance Committee last week to give their report. But with that, I'm here to answer any questions, but I'll let Bill do the official report. So.
Well, the first thing I would like to do is remind you, as the board charged with governance of the district, what our role was for the audit. The responsibility for the data and the disclosures that are in your financial statements rests with district management. We come out and perform our audit, provide the opinion that goes at the front of that document as to whether it fairly presents your financial position and the results for the year under audit. In addition, because the district earns more than $750,000 of federal grants, you are subject to a separate single audit on those federal grant expenditures. So as part of that process, we test internal controls and compliance on the financial statement audit. The federal. I don't think your mic is on. Oh. Mics, please. Okay. Better? Okay. So as part of both the financial statement audit and the federal single audit, we test your internal controls and compliance over the expenditures of your funds. You're also subject to an audit of your compliance with Minnesota laws and regulations. And then because the board has opted not to keep your extracurricular student activity accounts under board control within the general fund, we do issue a separate audit opinion on the cash receipts and disbursements of those extracurricular student activity accounts, and also a letter on internal controls and compliance. So as far as the results of the audit, on the financial statement audit, we once again issued an unmodified or clean opinion on the district's financial statements. It's the highest opinion that we can give. As Margot mentioned, there is an explanatory paragraph in there this year that you did have to adopt a new governmental accounting standard. That was standard number 73, which is a pension reporting standard. And essentially what this did is it set forth the requirements for reporting pensions that are not administered through a trust. So in addition to the statewide PERA and TRA pension plans that you report in your financial statements, you also have a district pension plan that is administered here just at the district. It's based on some of the bargaining unit contracts that you have. There's some clauses in there that create a pension benefit. The change for these plans kind of lined it up with the way you're reporting those statewide plans that are administered through a trust, and that instead of amortizing that liability onto your financial statements over time, you now are reporting that full estimated liability on your entity-wide financial statements. So that did change the net position on your entity-wide financial statements, reducing your net position by about $6.2 million due to that accounting change. From a compliance standpoint, we reported no internal control issues, no compliance findings with your financial statement audit. And I would mention here, just to follow up on something from last year, due to the amount of turnover you had in your business office in 2016, we did have a finding there that some of the monthly reconciliations that are one of the key controls in the handling of cash were not being done timely. We cited that as a deficiency last year, and I'm happy to report for 2017, everything was back on track as far as those reconciliations being done timely and regularly, so that finding has been fixed. From a Minnesota legal compliance standpoint, you did have one finding there. One of the 40 disbursements that we pulled for testing was not paid within 35 days of the receipt of goods or services or the invoice for goods or services as is required by state statute. It's by far the most common legal compliance finding that we give, but it is something that we need to try and do as far as paying those within 35 days of receipt. For your federal single audit, we issued a clean opinion on your schedule of federal award expenditures, that they're fairly stated in relation to the overall financial statements. From an internal control standpoint, there was one deficiency to report here, and this is a repeat of something that we reported in 2016. Your controls, overtime, and effort reporting for your special education federal program were not sufficient to assure that there was adequate documentation for all employees whose salaries were being charged to that program. What that means is anybody whose salaries you're submitting for federal reimbursement, you have to either have a semi-annual certification on file if they work 100% in that program, or monthly time reporting if they work in various programs. And for 3 of the employees that we pulled for testing, that documentation was not on file. Now, we did follow up on all of those. You'll see there's no compliance findings. We did not find that any of the costs that were charged against that grant were inappropriate or ineligible. However, you are required to have that documentation, so that is something you need to continue to work to get that documentation in place. On your student activities, we issued a clean opinion on your cash receipts and disbursements for your extracurricular student activity accounts. Again, these are kept outside of the district's general fund. We do report on a cash basis of accounting and qualify our opinion that we're only reporting on the recorded receipts, because you don't have the same controls out in the buildings for these small activity accounts that you do in your business office for your general receipts. And we do cite that as a control weakness, but I do want to recognize that the district did take steps to increase both the oversight and the amount of communication that's going on between the business office and the people out in the building that are overseeing those accounts to make sure that they're doing reconciliations the right way and timely, and spending in compliance with the manual for accounting for student activities that the state puts out. And we did not have any compliance findings this year. That was everything from a reporting standpoint. Before I move on to some of the numbers, questions? Okay. Next, I'll start with the graph you see here, which shows your general fund financial position over the last 10 years in terms of your year-end cash balance, and unrestricted fund balance. At the end of 2017 fiscal year, you had about $33.5 million in cash in the general fund, and you had a total fund balance of about $18.7 million. That was a decrease in fund balance of about $700,000. The unrestricted portion of fund balance that is on the graph here was about $15.5 million. The table on the next slide here shows the breakdown of the different buckets that your fund balance is reported in. Of that $18.7 million in total fund balance, you had about $129,000 reported as non-spendable. Essentially, that is equal to your prepaid expenditures, so it's still an asset to the district, but you can't spend it for something else, so it gets reported separately. You have about $3.1 million that is restricted by various state spending mandates. Most of that, in your case, is in the operating capital restriction. You have about $2.8 million, which has been committed by board action. Primarily, that is for cash flow, and you've got some residual federal funding that came through a few years back that you have not spent yet. And then your assigned fund balances were about $5.8 million at the end of the year. About $2.5 million of that is assigned for severance benefits, another $1.5 million for next generation program implementation, about $750,000 for bond operational costs, another $766,000 is site carryovers, and finally you've got about $130,000 for your alternative compensation program. Based on your current year expenditures, your unrestricted fund balance was about 14.5% of what you spent in 2017, excuse me. And about 6.5%, the unassigned fund balance is about 6.5% of those expenditures. And as far as your policy is concerned, you base that off of your next year's budget. As Margot mentioned, your unassigned fund balance is about 6% of your unassigned projected expenditures for 2018, so right in line with your board policy. Okay. One of the main factors that drives the amount of state aid you receive are the number of students that you serve each year. This graph shows the number of students served that generate general education aid for the district over the last 10 years. In 2017, you served about 8,464 average daily membership, which converts to about 9,277 pupil units, an increase of roughly 0.4%. Your student population has been relatively stable over the last half a dozen years. You haven't changed more than about 0.5% a year up or down over the last 5 or 6 years. This graph shows your general fund revenue compared to budget in the previous year. You took in just over $108 million in total revenues in the general fund. That was an increase of 7%, roughly $6.9 million from the year before. Almost all of that was in your tax levy, and almost all of that was due to capital. You had a new levy for long-term facilities maintenance that came through the general fund. You also had an increase in your capital technology referendum levy from the prior year. And there was a change in your operating capital funding. The balance between what comes through state aid and taxes shifted a little more towards the tax side, which drove your levy up a little bit there. Compared to budget, you were about $466,000 under budget in total in revenues in the general fund. There were a couple of variances that made that up. Your taxes were actually $1.2 million over budget, because part of that long-term facility maintenance levy had been budgeted in your building construction fund. Instead, it came into the general fund and was transferred to that fund through an operating transfer. Your state aids were about $1.6 million under budget. Most of that was due to an entry that you tried to project for your TRA program revenue and expenditure that comes through the district's books. It's based on what the state is contributing. They have a portion of your liability is paid by state contributions each year, and so the district recognizes an equal and offsetting revenue and expenditure to recognize that state contribution, and that was about $840,000 less than you had projected in your budget. So it's was off on both the revenue side and the expenditure side. It was less than you'd projected there.
And this is all in regards to the money that we contribute for retirement accounts, correct?
Correct. On the expenditure side, you spent just under $105 million in the general fund in 2017. That was an increase of about $4 million from the year before. It was basically split in two areas. Your salaries and benefits were about $2.3 million higher than the year before. Primarily, that was just inflationary increases to benefits and the contract steps and lay-in increases in your salaries. And then your capital expenditures were about $2.2 million higher than the year before due to the spending of some of those additional levy monies that are coming into the general fund. Expenditures were about $7.5 million under budget, roughly 6.5%. Most of this was due to that long-term facilities maintenance levy, which instead of being spent over in this fund, you transferred $4.1 million from the general fund over to your building construction fund. So due to the size of those projects, the state requires that you spend that out of that fund instead of the general fund. So you did have a transfer that you didn't budget for $4 million of that. Also, your purchase services were about $1.3 million under budget. The largest factor there was special education tuition, but also transportation, utilities were all under budget. Briefly, a few of the district's other operating funds. Your food service fund had a ending fund balance of about $1.15 million, which is $150,000 up from the year before, about $93,000 better than budget. Your community service fund ended the year with a fund balance of $484,000. That was actually a decrease of $540,000, and you'd budgeted to be just a little better than break even. The big change there was on the expenditure side. Your expenditures were about $520,000 higher than budget due to a few factors. You had a program expansion for your recess initiative program that went from 2 to 6 schools a little quicker than it was anticipated. And also there was some reallocation of some of your manager salaries that moved parts of 14 manager salaries into this fund that was not projected that way in your budget. And I don't have a picture of it, but just to mention your capital project fund, you did issue about $125 million in debt in 2016 and about another $17 million in 2017, and also transferred that $4 million in long-term facilities maintenance into this fund from the general fund. So you put about $146 million in resources into this fund in the last 2 years. As Margot said, you have a ton of projects going on. You did spend about $81 million in capital outlay in 2017, and at the end of the year you've got just over $60 million in fund balance restricted there to complete those projects. And this last slide then takes a look at the very first presentation in your financial statements, the statement of net position, which takes all of your fund information and puts it together into a single presentation, brings in all of the long-term assets and liabilities that aren't reported within the fund, so it gives you a full accrual, longer-term look at your financial position. So at the end of the year, you have a deficit net position of about $41,000. The top part of this presentation shows how you get from fund balances of about $82 million in total down to that deficit. Your capital assets, net of depreciation, are just under $200 million. You've got bonds and capital leases that you issued to build those capital assets of about $202 million. And then your pension, severance, and other post-employment benefits liability is about $117 million. That's the majority of how you get from your fund balances to that net position. You can see the change from 2016 to 2017 was primarily in that unrestricted net position, and that is directly related to the change in the pension liability that you're reporting, not only for your district pension plan with that accounting change this year, that went up by about $6 million, that liability, and your liability that you're reporting for the district's proportionate share of the statewide PERA and TRA pension plans went up by a net of about $32 million. So again, this isn't something that is going to affect what's going through your fund-based statements. You pay into these state plans based on the legislatively set contribution rates, and the only thing you really control for those plans is the number of employees that you have. But it is a recognition that as an employer with employees in those plans, a part of the underfunding for those plans is being generated by your employees. So every school district, and in the case of PERA, city, and other government organizations have to report their proportionate share of that underfunding for those plans. That was everything I had intended to go through from a number standpoint. Questions? Anything else you wanted me to get into further?
Does the board have any questions? This will be an action item for us this evening when we accept the audit. But current questions now. I know, David, we had this presentation in Finance Committee last week. Here.
If I could just add one thing. There was a number, as Bill referred to, accounting changes, a variety at the state level and governmental accounting standards. And so whether it's budget to actual or history, it'll take a year or two to kind of be able to see that. So we work in it in detail, so we know where those things are and the why behind it. But if you're looking at it, please give me a call, and talk through it, because I will say when you're just purely looking at the statements, even I catch myself, oh, that's right, that's that new GASB on the pension, and that's why that looks that way, or it's the change in the long-term facility maintenance coding that MDE came out with. And even I catch myself doing that. So please feel free to call me or email me, and I'm happy to answer those questions if it just doesn't look quite right. And it'll take a little bit of operating under this new regulations to get that history where it's a consistent fashion. So.
I know in Finance Committee, we also addressed some of the changes in community services, and knowing that with the construction and the inability to maybe offer as many programs, that some of that was what impacted their budget. I don't know if you wanted to expand on that any further.
I know that community services is taking a look at, they were anticipating that there would be some limitation on funds because of limitation on facilities, but also have some steps in place. They did have a fund balance, and at one-time use of fund balance is okay, and they are taking steps to make corrections, obviously, so that that doesn't continue forward, and that we don't continue to drain the fund balance. So.
All right, if there's no further questions, thank you, Margot.
Thank you, Bill.
All right, next up, Margot, I think you can stay, but Mary will be joining you as we will be going over a report on our enrollment projections, class sizes, and facilities report. Welcome, Mary.
Good evening, Superintendent Schultz, Board Vice Chair Patzloff, members of the school board, and members of the community. We're here tonight to present enrollment and facility information for the 2017-18 school year using enrollment data from Friday, September 29th. No, I thank you for driving. So slide 1 shows the difference from last year, the 2016-17 year, and 2017-18. You'll note a drop of 2 students, enrollment of 2 students. We did on this slide adjust middle school numbers to reflect the change in grade configurations from 9th grade going to the high school, and middle schools now being 6th through 8th grade. I think one of the biggest adjustments you would note in elementary, it looks like, well, we are down a difference of 10. Last year, if you remember, we had a very large kindergarten class, 606 kindergartners. This year, our kindergarten class is 577. So slide 2 shows a 3-year enrollment trend. You'll see that the number of open enrolled students are actually down 31 students from last year, and a total of 67 from the fall of 2015. You'll see the, oops, it's okay. You'll see the residents attending. So based on that, the actual resident enrollment for this year is up 29 students. You'll see that residents attending non-public schools increased by 40, or 24 total over the past 2 years. The biggest jump, it isn't shown here, but if you look in your board packet, you'll see that Benilde, St. Margaret, seemed to have had the biggest jump there. And then the residents attending elsewhere over the past 2 years has increased by a total of 32, with the biggest increase being in charter schools. We saw a pretty significant jump from this past year to this year in students enrolling in charter schools.
So this next slide compares what we call average daily membership, which is how we're funded. It takes the number of students, and if a student only attends the district a half a year, we get 0.5 for that student versus the actual student body count. And unfortunately, average daily membership doesn't end up being it always is less than the October 1 body count. And so this just is a reflection of that. So when Mary and I are working together and working with, we are always saying now, are we talking about enrollment or average daily membership? Because average daily membership is how we staff, it's how we also receive our funding.
I think it's important for members of the board and audience to see that there's a difference. So I might be in a building and think I have 1,100 students, when in actuality, the average weighted daily membership would only put me at maybe 1050. So for example, if you look at K5, it shows a difference of 52 when actually, when ADM is factored in, we're 35 students below projection in elementary. We have 52 more students, but we are below in when average weighted daily membership is calculated. Middle school, it looks like an increase of only 14 when actually when average daily membership is calculated, it's 36. And then finally with high school, it looks like an increase of 89 students. Well, at the end of the year, we're expecting average weighted daily membership to put us at 30 below. You can find the numbers I'm referencing on page 10 of the packet. You would see similar numbers to what we're talking about.
So just in layman's terms, what does that mean? I mean, I get that if a kid only attends for, the first semester, but why the big adjustments for you in the job that you do, Mary, in terms of calculating that and turning it into the funds that we receive from the state?
So how it works into the fund, there's a compounding effect to if we're on the average daily membership projections, if we have more students or more ADM, as we'll call them, or less. And so if you recall last June, I brought forward a resolution to adjust the 17-18 budget, 16-17 budget, because the average daily membership projections weren't coming in. Usually what occurs, we have the highest enrollment is October 1, and then it'll go down. But then sometimes it'll come back up a little bit. It's always the highest at October 1st. But in the winter, because you have families move in and out of the community and their needs change, and then you might see, in the middle of the winter, some ramping back up again. Again, still not as high. Well, last year what we saw is that consistently every month, I think till May, the enrollment count went down. Well, when you do that, then the average daily membership is going to be even lower. So we adjusted, my recommendation I brought forward to you in June was to revise the revenue budget for 16-17 even, because that projection was lower. That doesn't isolate only to 16-17. That compounds then in the 5-year projections where we actually end up in average daily membership now calculates forward using the October 1 enrollment count, but the 5 years worth of history that we have and moving forward, and it makes it less. I don't know if that helps you. Did it answer your question?
Well, I was just noticing in the audience, I mean, it's confusing. I mean, even being as a board member, the whole ADM and the way that they do it, because, as a parent, you're looking at body count.
Well, yes, you are. Yeah.
But ADM is, the way that we're funded. So just trying to, think of it from a parent's perspective. Yes, kids come and go, but you don't always see it the way that the state looks at it in terms of our funding.
And they have a very detailed process for keeping track of all that. The other thing I would say is, from a budget perspective, where I was talking about what did we budget for average daily membership to where we actually ended up. And that's what Mary's referring to. We also take a look at, well, where was the student enrollment count October 1 to October 1? So we try to be really clear when we're talking about one versus the other.
Yeah, I think the last piece is if you looked again at this, you'd say, oh, wow, we're up 155 students, when in actuality, we're down 29. So the swing difference is almost 200 students between what we enroll and, at least this year, what we're going to be collecting aid on. So then we put in elementary class size, and a couple things we did with this is, in the past we calculated an average, and this year we decided let's look at that range and say how many sections are we above that range, how many sections are we below. You can see in kindergarten where based on this slide we have 1 that's below and 0 that really are above. So we have at least 1 section that's below 20. In first grade, we have 6 above and 1 below. Now, we did add, as you were aware, because you were supportive of adding a 6th section at Concord, we continue to have a few higher sizes at both Highlands Elementary and Cornelia. And as the star indicates, they were given some additional paraprofessional help. So schools were given the choice of either an additional, some FTE type teacher or some paraprofessionals. In first grade, they chose paraprofessionals both at Cornelia and at Highlands. In third grade, where you'll also note the 2 above, those are 2 at Highlands, they chose to get some additional teacher support. With the exception of those, we don't have any that are wildly out of range. Our 4th grade class is probably one of the classes that we are consistently higher in across all grades. And then again, per board policy, we give support when needed.
I just want to point out though that we have about, I counted 22 that are over our guidelines for the sections and 23 that are under, which if you just glance at it, they kind of balance each other out, it averages out, but there is no average experience, they're only individual experiences. And so half of our students are experiencing the Edina education that's outside of our guidelines, it's outside of what we expect. Even though across the elementaries it balances out. So I don't see it as a net equal. I see it as half of them are problematic. And also the para support, I think it's important and I think it's the least we can do, but it doesn't get us back to where we wanted to be with our guidelines. It's a little fix.
And does some of this get compounded by resident move-in based on going to their home school? So like, for example, the 3rd grade example you said at Highlands, if 5 kids move into that neighborhood that are all 3rd graders, well, there's only 2 classrooms to spread those kids across, and they don't just go to a different elementary. I would think some of that would weigh into the upticks and downticks that we see in some of the classroom sizes. Is that true?
Yeah, and I don't think that there's any implying here that this looks good because we have an equal number above and below. I think it's just, those are just facts. Those are the numbers we have. That is exactly correct. So at Highlands, because we do have only 2 neighborhood programs, if you have a couple students move in a particular grade, you only disperse those students over 2 neighborhood classrooms, where at our other elementaries, it's potentially 4 or 5. So that can absolutely have a factor. And as I indicated, our 4th grade class is district-wide at 673 students. So when you think of a number like that, and you think of a range between 25 and 27, there are going to be some classes that are a little bit higher.
So I guess my question is for you guys is, what policies or processes would help even this out, or to help you in the future, so that we have fewer that are above the range? And maybe you can't answer that now, maybe that's a discussion for the future for us, but that would be helpful. If there's something that we have in the policy that would help or not help, that's making it more difficult. But I agree with Amir, for those kids, the walls of the rooms don't tend to get bigger, and so adding another adult with another kid does make a crowded classroom. And so how can we help ameliorate that? We did a little bit with the space, so we do have some flex spaces, but still, how do we address that in the future? Not for an answer now, but that's my question.
I guess I need more clarification on the question, because what I'm hearing, and this may not be accurate, but what I'm hearing is that clearly it would be helpful if all of our classes fell within that guideline. That's why the guideline exists, and there's an instructor. But if our total ADM is down, the funds aren't available to hire additional staff. So what I'm seeing is really a funding question. If we took in more students, we would have the funds to then take off, say we're at 6 above. If there were an additional 6 students, you have a different kind of option about another section, but if we're actually losing students, we're losing revenue. So I'm not sure if what we're asking is a policy question versus a revenue question, and maybe it's both. I mean, policy, we're following policy, and again, correct me, I think I heard the open enrollment is down a little bit as well. So if, and we certainly have the gatekeeping option per grade level. When grade level gets a level that is at our guidelines, we can close open enrollment for a grade or a site. But for the rest of these situations, when it's residential increase, that's strictly a revenue question and not really a policy question.
Well, for example, so if I look at the kindergarten, we have 118 at Concord, 94, and then we only have 79 at Countryside in that first program. So that's only, if I go across the 4 classes, that's 19, roughly 20 kids versus 23 or 20, higher as we go. So I guess my question is there something in the why would some of those students instead go to Countryside? Are some of these over and above, are those open enrollment students that are coming to a school, or are those higher resident students?
Great question. So actually, for kindergarten, we only have 48 open enrolled students. And so the neighborhood boundaries, so somebody might look at Cornelia as an example and say, wow, they've got 94. They're at capacity in kindergarten. That is probably our most mobile communities, particularly in kindergarten and first grade. And so those numbers are, again, there we only have 7 open enrolled students. Concord, we only have 7 open enrolled students. We had 8 students from July 5th through September 29th in kindergarten at Countryside that dropped or chose not to attend for a variety of reasons. And so based on attendance boundaries, our families have a choice to attend their neighborhood school. And there are times where, depending on the grade, there is increased populations at certain parts of neighborhoods and certain parts not. Countryside is also our largest open enrolled elementary school and has been for a number of years.
Really? And I think that would be helpful for the community to see what the number of open enrolled is in that, because I think I think there's a perception that the open enrollment is causing these bubbles. And it appears, at least from what you were just telling me, that it's a lot of resident movement in and out, or at certain sites. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, I think can there have been an occasional grade or class where open enrollment did spike? Absolutely. But when we look across the board, it's based on who's so Concord, there are 7 open enrollment students in that 118, and all of them, except 2, have siblings. So I looked at the numbers. So 41 of our 48 open enrolled students fall under the policy of either being an open enrolled sibling or a staff member. So that is very few students that aren't part of the policy, at least in kindergarten this year, that we're trying to honor. John, so the next one would be secondary. And so really I think this slide is somewhat, there's a lot of data on here and it's somewhat self-explanatory. What we're really trying to get at is the guideline range for middle school is at 27.2. It's not a perfect number, but when you look at all of the courses in the 2 elementary schools, in the 2 middle schools, we come out at about 27. So we're actually there under the ratio. And then high school would be actually the same. So the guideline for high school is almost 31. And you can look at our classes and our sections, and although there are clearly classes at the high school that are very, very high, when the data is pulled, this is what the high school average class size is, just under 29.
And again, help me to make sure I understand this correctly. Often with the high school, the factors that go beyond the enrollment that you're keeping track of, Mary, but there's also the issues of how many sections they can offer in a class. Say for like the facts, there's only 7 sections. And then there's how many kids are choosing to take it, what hours they need to fit it in based on their other class schedule. I gotta believe that there's a lot of factors that play into those high school and even middle school schedules that go beyond just making sure we're hitting our class size guidelines. That there may be, of your 7-period day, one class that's got 30-some kids in it, but another class that has half a dozen kids, well, probably not half a dozen, but 20 kids in it, just because of all those factors that go into it.
Yeah, and and one thing we didn't do here is we didn't do the guideline range. And we thought about doing that is, so the smallest class might be 23 and the largest class might be 35, but that doesn't give you a sense of how many are there. I think the other piece, so that you speak to, is again, when you look at that average weighted daily membership and enrollment, if we have a large number of students and they're in a particular class, and those aren't the kids who choose not to attend or aren't going PSEO, I mean, that can really factor into numbers also. So you could have a math class, as an example, with 35 students because that's how it was staffed when they built the schedule. And then the next slide, I'm turning over to Margot.
So this is a 5-year projection on the October 1st enrollment count, okay? We have a different projection for the average daily membership amount. But it just shows basically over the 5 years we're slow and steady. We do grow at the slightly at the elementary level. We actually end up declining at the middle school level, and then increase just slightly at the high school level. And there will be ebbs and flows in those 5 years, and we continue to do this type of report annually, but we're looking at it monthly all the time to see how it's impacting the district. We didn't prepare a slide on it because, to be honest, it's too detailed, but I will talk about the capacity piece for a little bit here. It is included in your report. We did not include that in last year's report because we had so much change in facilities going on that we took a year off from that. Did use the same traditional format that we've used for many, many years. I will say that we do need more time, so I would consider it a work in progress in that to learn how we're going to use that capacity information and our new spaces. So while we have individual whether it's elementary or secondary, we have individual classrooms, we now have different types of learning spaces. And how is that helping us in capacity? Can we say that students are in a learning space all the time? No, but it is helping us with capacity. And I would like to reference some other school districts that have had those kinds of personalized learning spaces and common learning spaces for a number of years to see how they're incorporating that into their capacities, work with our architects on it, and so it's a work in progress. It's not an absolute yet, but I didn't want to go 2 years in a row without providing you that kind of information. I think the upside is the numbers look much better than they did 2, 3, 4 years ago because we have added classrooms to our facilities. And the other piece within the elementaries and isolating the elementaries alone, those projections make an assumption that a school moves forward based on their previous, the previous 5 years' history and moves forward. We did not make any adjustments right now in the projections because we need a little more time and research. When you have center-based programs in the schools, like Normandale, like Countryside and Highlands, that impacts a pure 5-year projection. And so I want to caution against if you see a negative in one particular school in 1 year in one grade level or something like that, that especially if it's getting further out, there's some work to be done because of the isolated, center-based programs that we have. And also we do have the functional capacity, but we also have the maximum capacity. So again, it's kind of a range. And there might be times we're under-functional and there might be times we're over-functional. When we get to that maximum is where we, start to get concerned. And that's where we were watching, if you remember 3, 4, 5 years ago, is where we were starting, particularly at the secondary level, to take a look and say, what do we need to do, because we're getting really tight, and at some of the elementaries too, which is why we added additions. So hopefully that helps give you some background on the capacity pieces. If you have questions, certainly give me a call. But again, that's a work in progress and not an absolute yet. I think there's more we need to do. Even as I looked at it, I thought, okay, we're putting it in the traditional format, but we do not have traditional learning spaces anymore, and we need to do some more work on that.
I appreciate that, that consideration of what capacity is. I could see a couple different ways that it gets changed. One would be sort of district office thought alone about what the capacity could be hypothetically if it was used a certain way, which could very quickly become disconnected from, in practice, what the capacity of our buildings are if the spaces aren't being used in a way that was thought of up here. And it could also be that the district starts requiring that spaces be used a certain way so that the building has more capacity. That's an option. Maybe not the greatest. And the last one is that you watch and see how these spaces are being used and just take the lead from the teachers and account for that in our numbers. So that, to me, that seems like it would most likely be where our numbers matching reality, that this extra space provided a certain amount of capacity, not the extra we thought was possible, not the less that we feared, but really this is how it's practiced now. And I imagine that'll change over years. But that'll be different from building to building unless we go with more of the top-down approach.
So I think that's why it's a work in progress, because we haven't been living in the spaces for that long, but yet we, again, wanted to provide the information. When we did take a look at capacity, it's about 5 years ago now, we did go out to the buildings, so it wasn't complete, a top-down, where we met with the principals and walked the buildings, and how are the spaces being used? What's this space for? What's that, And there's individualization in each of the buildings, but yet there are commonalities in how they use the spaces. So I think, again, some time to live in this space. How are we using it? Maybe compared to other districts who have been using those types of spaces for more years than we have. And also working with the district architects, the principals, and the sites, and coming up with something I would say probably a year from now in the report, because I think we need to live in the space for a year.
So do we think we might, are you saying that maybe we'll do another one of those walkthroughs sort of periodically, maybe sometime at the end of this year, maybe next year, to see how everybody's using the spaces?
I haven't had a discussion with anybody about it yet, but I was thinking, get through this part, and it's probably time to do that again, and maybe also have a talk about the timing of a demographic study again.
I know we're right now putting the context around what capacity is and how maybe we're being a little too conservative with what the capacity numbers are, but it's not just the functional capacity that we're starting to see numbers projected to go over. It's also the maximum capacity, particularly in our elementary schools, and not just the center programs, but I saw it at Cornelia, Concord, Riverdale, and Highlands. The high school was going over functional, but not max, but those elementaries were going over maximum capacity. So I'm a little confused as to what that number means. Who responds to it? Is it just sort of a data point, and if you go over it for a year or two, that's not a trend that's worrying, or is that worrying? Because I see that in our 5-year projections.
So what I would say again is it's a work in progress. It's not absolute yet. If we had gone through living in the space, researched other school district, and done some of the things I talked about, and we had a consistent practice of reporting the capacity with these new learning spaces, then I would say we need to have conversations. But I think there's more work to be done to provide better information for you.
My only lingering worry with that is it's so long before we can really steer district numbers in any significant amount. That, for example, open enrollment, once we've accepted students, they're here, they can graduate from here. And if we decide that we're not using our spaces the way we might have done, that's just on us that our numbers are what they are, even if our capacity stays as it is. And if we don't have any wiggle room between that function and max, if we already expect to go over a maximum capacity we really need these spaces to come through for us. That's our lifeline at this point. And so it very well could be that they do, but with how difficult it is to change enrollment numbers, I don't see much of an alternative.
Yeah, I think I would just comment, we've never communicated elementary capacity in this way. In the past, we had a single sheet where we had everything listed. So this, by doing this, maybe it created a little bit more confusion. As Margot indicated, we have not had a chance to see what the space is really like, how people are using the space. Two of the buildings haven't even finished construction yet. So I think it is going to take a little bit of time to determine, especially at the elementary level, how we are using the space. This is a very early, different way of communicating the elementary in particular. We have not done it this way. So that can also then, the good news is you see a lot of data, the potential uncertainty then, does it create some anxiety because it looks like we haven't taken all things in consideration? And I think it really has more to do with not having had a chance to look at how the lived space is being utilized. We're 2 months into it for most buildings.
Mary, can we go back to the elementary numbers? I just have some questions after I've looked at it for a while. So if we go back to the earlier slide that listed the elementary grades, John's clicking. Yeah. Okay. So here's what I'm confused about. So we've got fourth grade. We have 6 above, 0 below, and still our average class size is 26.9. Our guidelines are 25 to 27.
So here would be an example, and I can cite specific schools in fourth grade. At Highlands, we have both classes are 29. Those would be 2 that would be above the guideline. At Countryside, we have two classes at 28 and 1 at 29. Well, there is, again, 3 schools that are above that 27 guideline. And then I'd have to see probably what happens.
So 0 below means we must have a bunch right at 25?
We do. Okay. So like the average at Concord, 25.8, Cornelia, 26, 28.3, 29, 27.5. And then it could depend on, again, I built this classroom. These are the students I've assigned to this classroom. 4 have left from this room, which could have put one, although we don't have any below, but could have put one right at 25 when something else is at 27 or 28.
Okay, that clarifies. And then, Amir, you indicated that you felt half of our kids were in a not normal classroom. But when I look at the numbers, we got 22 above, which is 14%, and 23 below, which is 15% of the sections.
Yeah, I think that's right. That's a good thing.
Okay, so I was just not clear where you got the information. Okay, so that's very helpful, Mary.
Thank you.
Because it gets a little misleading because we appear within the range. It's just that we have some just slightly on the outside.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And then our last slide will be the summary statement. One other thing I would, just as I think a point of information is, so we started tracking all withdrawals and enrollments from July 5th through September 29th, and we had 245 new students enroll during that period of time. That's pretty significant. From July 5th through September 29th, and most of them 245, yes. And we also had 282 withdrawals. So what we need to continue to challenge our office in is how can we do a better job of having some of that communicated earlier? Because when I look at some of the cases, it's families that are moving out of town, out of the state, out of the country, and some have chosen to go to non-public, charter, private. Can we get that information a little bit quicker? We can't control the numbers that we have enrolling in, but can we do a better job in our office of getting the numbers moving out, which then I think hopefully will help with what our numbers are as of October 1st.
Do we collect any data when you talk about getting the request to withdraw? Do we ask why they're withdrawing to whatever their choice is? Do we track that, or just that they've gone to X school?
Yeah, I've got a whole list from people who are attending their home district, Norwood Young America, moving out of state, moving to St. Paul, moving to Texas, moving to Bloomington, attending Eagle Ridge. I mean, whatever the case is, we have been, because of, I think, of a situation last year, we wanted to be really clear on who's leaving, where are they going to, why are they leaving, when are we being notified? I think the more data we have about that, the better we can continue to serve our families.
So when we are losing kids to various private schools or charter schools, do we see any kind of trend in the rationale for doing that?
We've never asked. Yeah, so we've never really asked why somebody has made that individual choice. So we've now got the data where they're going, but as far as asking, why have you taken your child out of Edina, there could be just a variety of reasons.
Okay, so and can we track that, or is that not?
Sure, we could just ask.
Yeah.
And it's hard to guess, even when someone does something that you could easily see a reason for. They've gone to a faith-based school, they've gone to their home district. But why? Are they drawn to a robotics program? Are they running from bullying? It may not be the most obvious reason. And so it's not something I think we'll get scientific on, but perhaps we can start to get some anecdotes.
But a companion to that would be also worth knowing, why do people choose to move into it?
Thank you.
That was my
Very
next
good,
question as
very
well.
good.
Because we have movement both ways.
Maybe specifically, and not just boarding schools.
Right. I think there's a lot of different reasons that meet the individual needs of students and families.
right.
But we also have a lot of students who choose to enroll in here, or who have left and choose to come back. Yes.
I had a couple more points this
Mary
morning.
still has a sample.
Oh, I thought we were wrapping up. Good.
Yeah. We've got the summary statements. Margaret, would you like to?
Sure. I think briefly covering that over a 5-year period, roughly, some years a little less, some years a little bit more, about 0.5% a year. So what I call slow and steady. Again, as I stated earlier, when you break it down, elementary is growing slightly and high school grows slightly, and middle school declines just a little bit in that 5-year period. And you can find an individual year where an area might go up or down. So that's slow and steady. It certainly is better than declining, but from an overall district-wide perspective, back to the discussion earlier about budget and revenue, it's not a significant increase each year. While you can find pockets in a classroom of the actual enrollment count that feels like a lot of growth, district-wide, we're not seeing 5-6% growth. That brings different challenges for a district to address. That's not our future according to this, unless there's some major new development coming into the city, and that's where we'd need a demographic study. So, and we continue to use the models that we have in place, and also use other resources. So, Mary, would you add anything else?
No.
Okay.
Thank you.
Question, so for the, like for Normandale, we've capped that program for the last 20 years.
And that's, yeah, we'd cap it.
So with your projections, how did you arrive at projections if we've got a limit in that program?
Are you talking about capacity or enrollment?
Projected enrollment. So why is the projected enrollment going up there where the program is always capped as far as enrollment?
And you're looking at the capacity worksheet, though, correct?
Yeah.
Yes. That's where I said I didn't stop the model from moving the individual schools forward as if they were just an open school. And what needs to be done is some more time, which in the past used to do. The center-based programs that do have a capped limit, you've got to override the model to say, this isn't going above X amount, and that's why it's a work in progress. That's not done yet. Okay?
Thank you.
Well, one of them is just.
We're just not going to let you go, Mary.
Okay.
Margaret.
So the growth, I don't understand the difference between the average daily and the October 1. But the projected growth is about 140 over the years that we projected either way at this point, elementary-wise, which is about 1 student per section, as we're not running about 150 sections, about 1 student per section. So if we're right now just averaging out in our range, right, a little over, a little under, this is sort of planning to bump that up on an average of 1 student per elementary school section, which concerns me. And it's not just 1 student, because 1 equals 28. If you were planning on 27 and you're 1 over, those are 28 students over a class that's over. So I just foresee, as these projections come, that things will get tighter. And the other, maybe even the biggest concern I have is I've counted 8 different ways that we keep an eye on enrollment. And we sort of emphasize different ones and in context at different times, and it's very hard to keep our eye on the ball. And those 8 ways are the class sizes themselves, total enrollment in the district, which if we're not building more classrooms is sort of getting at the same thing. The graduating class size, we've heard, already we're looking towards getting to 700, that's one of the goals, but that's a whole different way of keeping your eye on enrollment. Are we there? How are we doing on our graduating class size? The general growth, right, even when it's slow and steady, and I've heard the number between 0 and 0.5% a year, which is our general aim, that's a way to keep an eye on enrollment that's disconnected from others. The capacities, functional capacity and maximum capacity, which, I want to just really emphasize and understand the point about that not being one to really seize on right now. So I mentioned a lot earlier, but just for general context. And then finally, balancing the books. Comments about slow and steady growth, but it's better than declining. Those are financial comments, and obviously it's paramount that we have a functioning school district, and our income and expenditures are a huge part of that. But that makes it the 8th way of keeping track of our enrollment, and not a research-based way, but just a practical way. And so as we look at these 8 different ways, it's very hard for me to really believe we're going to keep it in a place we're comfortable with when we just keep bouncing back and forth between these metrics. I don't know what the answer is. It may be that we set harder caps on some of them, because I think some of our caps, some of our maximum capacity, maximum class size, it's not that big of a maximum. It's kind of a maximum goal. But if we said total enrollment, ADM isn't going to go above 8,500, that's a pretty powerful statement. And that's not one that I've heard anybody else ask for me. But I don't want to put it on.
Wouldn't that affect the budget if we look at it purely on an ADM?
Absolutely. But if all we do is keep an eye on the budget with open enrollment being the email home for money, that's going to create problems on these other 7 metrics, which we also value.
I think there's a variety of terms that we use in enrollment or different ways of calculating, some of which are not determined by us here within the district. We have to comply. So, for example, the average daily membership and all the very detailed MARS student reporting that Mary's team does day in and day out. I cannot begin to explain the detailed record keeping on each individual student that we educate. And it's all from a statewide perspective, and even federally, it's funding based. But yet, if we truly only kept to that terminology, and I'm the finance person, so I'm going to be the one who's going to talk to you about the funding, right? If we only talk about that measure, I mean, what people feel and see are the student bodies in the classroom. And from a facility standpoint, I'm a teacher and these are the students in my class, we have to talk about enrollment and capacity as well. And so I don't disagree that it can get confusing, but it is what we deal with. And we do, we're trying to provide a report in the best way that we can and be very clear when we're talking about one type of thing versus another type of thing, and try to keep that communication consistent. But yes, there are differences. Mary, would you add anything else?
Any other discussion? Thank you very much. I know
Thank you.
it is a constant moving target and something that we're all trying to keep our eyes on, but I know that Mary, your group works really hard at that, so thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Next up is curriculum review process. Randy.
Good evening. Acting Chair Patzloff, Superintendent Schultz. What did I say, Schwartz? It's late. I'm gonna pay a quarter for that, aren't I? Schultz. School board, our community members. This evening's presentation is just to share some background information on our curriculum review cycle, which is something that we typically share each year, and then a little bit of update on our curriculum review process in Edina Public Schools. This is a for information only presentation. There's no action being asked by the board this evening. There's 4 points that I'll be touching on this evening related to some of these elements, and they include the curriculum review process itself. So I'll take you through some of the steps that are typical of a review process here in Edina. We'll also talk about the curriculum review cycle. That cycle will also be posted on the website. I believe it's in an appendix in one of our policies as well, so we typically try to update that periodically. I'll briefly mention some of the future adoptions of materials that we have coming up, and then talk a little bit about our course proposals and our course changes process that we go through on an annual basis at the secondary level. There's no buttons on here, but it's working. Okay, so are you driving? I'm so sorry. I don't know why I said that. I'm gonna pay for it, though. I know. So in terms of our curriculum review process, it's really a multi-year process. It typically goes across 3 or 4 years. And our year one is the year that we start some preliminary data collection. And so that's kind of our preparatory year. What we typically do in that year one is we organize a design team. The design team will consist of teachers and administrators. Typically the teachers represent regular education, special education, our gifted and talented area, our EL, our technology teachers, and what we try to achieve is balance on that committee. Our goal is really to have balance across gender, across experiences, across skills, across race and ethnicity of our staff that are involved, and some of those goals are a challenge for us, and so we have to get more creative about how to achieve those. And we also go and establish a budget for that following year. We create a project plan, and then we begin the data collection process. And that data collection process involves gathering performance data, gathering growth data. It involves creating a plan for surveys. We want to enhance the process by adding some focus group opportunities into that curricular review process. And all of those are intended ways to grab stakeholder voice at the beginning of the process. So we head into year two. We start off with reviewing that district level data around performance and growth, stakeholder feedback through surveys and focus groups. Then we move into looking at research trends, looking at what the data out there in the research world is telling us. And then we move into determining some guiding principles that are going to help guide that particular review and study. One of the pieces that we want to make standard in our process is to also create a web page for communications with families so that they can follow along in the process and see how that particular curriculum adoption is progressing. We've done that at times, but we want to make that a consistent part of our process. in terms of oops, if you can go back one. In terms of going too fast. In terms of processing the data, we also go and take an in-depth look at the standards and unpacking the standards. In particularly, we look at which of those standards are priority standards or the most significant of all of the standards. We also look at alignment issues and discuss alignment issues as a team, and then we begin the materials review process. We do use a lens of equity as we look at those processes. We're looking for materials that are culturally responsive, that meet the needs of our kids. We're also looking at trying to get various samples from vendors. We narrow it down into vendor presentations, and oftentimes we'll have 3, 4, or 5 different vendor presentations. We're looking at materials that support differentiation, instruction in the classroom, but also support assessment and assessment design. Sometimes those materials are books, sometimes they're digital materials, sometimes they're equipment. It just really depends upon the content area that is under review. The materials that we purchase for art might look very different than the materials that we purchase for math, as an example. Into year 3, we're now into really the materials get selected and get purchased in that year 3, and that typically will happen over the summer. We use rubrics that are developed by the design team to score those materials. The criteria are often based on research, the data, and the feedback that we've collected. Included in those rubrics will be whether or not materials are culturally responsive. Are they engaging to the kids that we serve inside of Edina? Does it support differentiation? Just as a couple of quick examples, we score those materials on a rubric. We do include costing in that scoring, and then oftentimes we'll ask teachers to begin to pilot those materials so that we can use that additional feedback. The committee will make a recommendation. Again, cost is a factor in there. It's not the only factor, but it's an important piece of it. And then we'll take that to the school board and seek approval. In the past, the board has approved general expenditures and items. Sometimes those aren't specific to particular items. For example, the board might not specify specific books, but you might approve a general expenditure. For example, last spring, we came to you with a general expenditure around classroom libraries for K-5 elementary classrooms. Again, you didn't approve the specific books in those libraries in terms of process. Our design team selected those, but you approved the general parameters and the expenditure in that particular example. Then once we have board approval, we would place the order. We now use contracts with vendors so that we can secure financial costs through the life of the adoption. And that's a new piece that we just started doing. And we also then begin the initial training process or professional development. Oftentimes we have a combination of face-to-face training and then some online training or online support for teachers. We move into year 4. In year 4, we are now deeper into implementation. We start moving into a continuous improvement cycle. We begin to implement some of the assessments that came along with the curriculum and the assessments that were written by the design team. And those common assessments are used as a quality assurance component across the school system so that regardless of school or regardless of teacher, we have evidence that students are achieving the deliverables across the school system. Again, we enter really into what's basically a maintenance cycle, and at times enrollment might vary or change. As you've seen from the last presentation, we might need to invest in some more materials. So again, our contract with the vendor secures that pricing. And then we are really moving into, I'll do the next slide. Really here is just a short, quick glimpse of the curriculum review cycle. You can see how those different content areas in this example are reviewed in a 6 to 8 year cycle. It kind of depends on the content areas. Generally, on average, it's probably 7 years. We have had some content areas that hadn't been reviewed in 10 years or in 15 years. And so now I think we have that all organized, and all of this aligns with our budget parameters as we work with Margot Bach to create a budget around teaching and learning every year. And then we will update this again on our website, and again, it will be updated in appendix in policy. One of the drivers around this schedule is when states require the state standards, and so we try to align these adoptions up with when states are rolling out with the new state standards. Oh, good question. So the X is really year 2. It's really year 2, and that's really the meaty part of the adoption process. And at the end of that year is when we would be seeking purchase of materials, and then that actually comes out of the following year in terms of budgeting.
Well, I was just, when is general world language review? Because I see French language arts, but I don't see general world language review, like Spanish, like, all the other languages.
Yeah, it's on here. It's actually an extended table, and so we're only seeing the top half of it as an example. So I apologize for that, but it will be posted on the website and in the appendix, and I can certainly forward that full slide to the board.
I just was going to point out, when we were talking about this at Teaching and Learning, I remember you sharing with us that the reason we so closely follow the state's guidelines as to when they're going to change curriculum, so that we don't purchase curriculum, the year before they change everything, and now we've got curriculum that's not going to be supporting our students' needs based on state requirements.
Right, that's exactly it. So we're trying to be efficient in making sure that when the state says, here's what our students should be learning in science or in math or in language arts, that then we follow suit with the materials review right after that time frame, so it's in sync. Occasionally we do have, we buy a lot of materials to support our advanced placement courses at the secondary level, and College Board will oftentimes do updates to their AP courses, and then we need to consider those updates, and we might have to deviate from this for a particular class or for a particular set of courses based on some information that's dictated to us by College Board. So in terms of curriculum review process, some future adoptions, we have 612 math occurring this year. So Mark Carlson is our new teaching and learning specialist working with mathematics in K-12. So he's going to be working with the secondary math design team on some of that math work. And K-5 French language arts reading, notice that we did reading at the K-5 level about a year ago. And so typically what we do is the following year or the 2 years after that, we follow suit with French language arts programming around that. In 2018-19, we have K-12 art and K-12 music coming up. I know in the past we've done K-5 adoptions and 612 adoptions, and we're trying to really sync those where we can. Sometimes it's cost prohibitive to do it, and we're trying to move to a cycle that syncs those K-12 so that we can look at the entire experience across the K-12 continuum and look at how curriculum in the K-5 arena then transitions and melds with the curriculum in the 612 arena. We have 612 French language arts reading that will continue then, so we have that whole K-12 look. In 2019-20, we'll be looking at K-12 science and then a full review of 612 language arts.
Now, would it be difficult if we, say, added an enriched 9th or 10th grade language arts to find a curriculum for that out of sequence like this?
So I think part of our process is to enhance the ways we take feedback in between the length of these 7-year cycles so that we can better meet the needs each year. And I'll talk about course changes and course proposals in just a second. I think it'll get to your question.
And Leny, just to add to this, right now we're in the middle of our K-5 review of math.
Right.
But it's in the stage of being currently tested or piloted this year by some of our teachers. Is that correct?
We actually did that piloting last year, and so we're actually in a 2-year implementation at the elementary level for math. We did have a number of staff that felt that they were ready to move ahead, so we split it into a 2-year implementation and kind of deviated from what we typically do. I think what we uncovered is the really strong benefit of having implementation specialists at each of the elementaries that can really help and support the teachers that are doing the 2nd year implementation. So we'll have those folks that have been through it for a year and are excited and jumped on board. and they'll be able to support the rest of the staff in their buildings in year 2. So we actually are getting some great feedback from some of the staff around that, and we think that that'll be potentially a new model for how we do some implementations, specifically at the elementary level. In our next slide, we also have course proposals and course changes that happen on a yearly basis. And so the way this works, this is an annual process. So new course proposals can be developed by teachers or developed by administrators, and then they enter into the discussion. And so this is one of the ways that we look at how program continues to change. This is really specific to the secondary level, however, but it's one of the ways that we look at how programs continue to evolve and change on an annual basis. So of course, with 9th grade going to the high school last year, we had quite a few different course proposals, but mostly we had over 100 course changes to courses in the course catalog. We offer over 400 courses at the high school level, so it's a lot of courses to maintain, and it's a lot of courses to monitor in terms of development, so it really helps to have a cycle where we're looking at specific sets of courses at a time. For this process, once courses are submitted as a new course or as a course change, we bring that to the content and area leaders. So those are the teacher leaders for content areas at the middle school and at the high school. And we make sure that that department has had a chance to review that and weigh in. And then from there, it goes to a secondary administrative team, which will include all of the principals and myself. And we'll review it. From there, we'll bring the proposals to the Teaching and Learning Board Committee and dialogue about those proposals, dialogue about those changes there. And then we'll prepare them for presentation to the school board for discussion in December and then action in January. That falls well in line with our sequence for adapting the registration materials, which then go out to families in February. So we do have a 1-month opportunity for the community to weigh in on the proposals, to weigh in on the changes between December and January, and that just helps us facilitate that process.
And then Randy, is this the time in this process where new courses that were presented last year or the year before, we would get updates on how those are going?
Yeah, that's a great question in terms of timing. So we did have some course proposals that were put forward last year but weren't being implemented this year. They were intended to be implemented next year, so we'll come back, we'll do an update on those. We also have the capstone proposal as a graduation requirement, and we'll come back and do an update on that element as well. And then lastly, in summary, in terms of our curriculum review process, again, to just remind you, it's really teacher-led in terms of the design team. It's facilitated by teachers on special assignment and or administrators in teaching and learning. Typically occurs every 7 years on average. Our goal is to really front-end load the stakeholder input at the beginning of the process. We ensure that it's aligned to state standards in terms of our adoption, and the process and updates are to be posted on our website and make that part of our standard process. In terms of continuous improvement, course changes, additions, modifications occurring in December and January. And so that was our update from teaching and learning around our process. Are there any other questions that the board has around this?
Well, just that question about would the curriculum review process be an hindrance to adding some enriched courses in 2 grades outside of the typical 7-year cycle?
So I think that is all part of the conversation when our departments get together and talk about, what are the things that we're missing, what are the things that we're interested in adding, and it's an opportunity for those departments to talk through that and propose those courses.
But it's not the only way courses get proposed, and if it were more of an administrator-led decision, would the curriculum adoption process be a hindrance, or that's just something we could adjust, we could modify, find curriculum, have 2 different levels? The reason I'm asking is because typically we consider what courses are being offered, the how, it's management, it's district, but the philosophy of having enriched options, the philosophy of having different levels of pace and depth, to me is more than a how. Not even just a what, but even a why. That's something that could be a top-down implementation, and so it's not just the community wondering what's going to be proposed to the board, but how could the board get this done? And would the curriculum review process be a problem? How many years turnaround would you need? Could it happen in the fall of 18? Or that's a joke, but the fall of 19 is the accelerated timeline.
Yeah, I think it's dependent upon what courses, the scope of it, you know, what we're talking about in terms of the scope across 612. I don't think it's necessarily a hindrance to the process, but I think maybe it might be an extended conversation with the board around what are some of the desires for the types of courses that we're not currently offering that the board would like to see the school district offer.
Any other questions or comments? Thank you, Randy.
Thank you.
All right, next up we have policy review. And Regina, are you going to walk us through these three tonight that are under discussion?
Thank you. I'm happy to. So 2 of these, as noted in the board packet, 2 have been seen before. So I'm going to just start with some of the adjustments to policy 620, course credit for learning. The board had an opportunity to discuss this on September 24th. And we took some of the comments that were made at that meeting. The policy committee has come back with some edits and hopefully some clarification. So one is the title, Receiving Course Credit for Learning, and the intended clarifications throughout the policy reference fulfilling graduation requirements, and so this is particularly applicable to grades 9 through 12. The text throughout the policy is hopefully clarifying that there are basically 2 categories that are being discussed. One is a transfer of credits for students who are joining Edina High School from another district, and then the second category is credit by assessment in lieu of taking the course. Credit by assessment is further broken down into 2 choices that each student has. Assessment can be done by a test or a portfolio. So that's the general scope of the changes to 620, and I'll just pause and see if anyone has any questions before this is moved forward for action in November.
I know Chair Leny had several questions, but you connected with him and
Yes.
incorporated
And
those, okay.
yes, all of this discussion is flowing from the discussion that happened in September.
Okay.
So I'm going to move on to 629. This is our first opportunity on this cycle to take a look at student fundraising. The 2 specific areas of updates are for compliance with state and federal guidelines, and that's in section 4K, just simply stating that fundraising activities do need to comply with the relevant guidelines. And then in 8A, specifically stating that funds need to be sent specifically to an identified organization and cannot go through a student account. So that's just a standard statute change.
If I can, I had a problem though with the parallel structure of 8.1, which doesn't really, it's the first of a list of things that the district may be permitted when, and then instead of following the structure of the rest that follows, it just says the funds should be sent directly to an individual organization. So I think it should be more like something like the prior. The district may be permitted when the funds are sent directly to an organization.
Could you restate that again?
I could give it to you.
Yeah. Or just go ahead and read it again, please.
Something like may be permitted when the funds are sent directly to the non-district organization.
So stated as more of a positive.
Right, because that's the structure of the 2
So just making sure that there's alignment in the
structure of
okay.
subpart, and then also the third thing.
Thank you. Well, we can take a look at that again and just make sure that the language that we choose is consistent with the accounting guidelines and recommendations. That's good enough. Any other notes? Okay, 634, electronic technology acceptable use. We talked about this with the board on August 14th. The primary change to this policy as a result of that discussion is in the general statement of policy with the first sentence, which is intended to further clarify, better clarify what the policy is about. Any other notes on 634? It's been updated a couple times on the cycle.
Yeah, this is not its
so
first run
Yeah,
through.
it's not its first, no, not its first go around, but they get better every time we look at them.
Okay, the only thing that I noticed in that one, and I think this is something we've discussed before, but the fine line of social media use off and on campus and ramifications to the students on campus activities. Did you guys have any further discussion around that, or is there something in particular that we use as an example to help guide us?
There's no new language that's being proposed in that regard, but that kind of language exists in more than one policy.
Okay.
So, for example, the discipline policy, which the policy committee has recommended, that have a task force review it on a much deeper scale. Some of those guidelines regarding internet usage and potential abuse of the internet, the device, and the website, some of them are covered in that policy. So there's nothing new in this particular policy that's different from what we've seen.
Thank you.
So that's it for this particular, Randy.
The purpose here is educational programs, but does it also include visitors in the building, parents in the building, everybody else? We need to clarify that. It's within the district.
Sure.
But I'm just asking that question. I'm not saying we have to expand that, but I think if this is intended to cover that, maybe it's clear.
I'm not sure that it is. That's a good question. So what I'd have to do is take it back to the committee so we can take a look at other policies. We do have policies specifically about visitors in the building. So it's not my understanding that this is intended to cover that. However, it's worth clarifying.
That would normally be in the 900s, right?
It would normally be in the 900s, and we do have other segments about visitors in the building, distribution of information, which that's another policy. So this is, as you mentioned initially, this is more about educational programs and educational use. But it's a good question, and I'll take it back and see what we can find.
All right, any more discussion around our three policies up for discussion?
Just one more about the last one. Do we have anything, or should we have anything in the policy regarding the prevention of whatever technologies were employing to try to avoid having to access
You're referencing 630. You mean
So
using
I think
something
that-
to...
Because I think the policy says what we will do, but my understanding is, for my understanding is that there are ways that we have of using proxy servers or other devices to circumvent our gatekeeping.
So some of this is, and Steve can answer this far better than I can, but some of this language is addressed in section H. So with actually all of 5 unacceptable uses, goes through quite a list of different circumstances that are covered. But you may be asking a deeper question in this section of the policy.
Are you talking about if a student would like tether their phone to their computer so that they're not going through the district's internet server? So then we don't have those gatekeeping mechanisms to stop certain sites?
Or if they're just using their computer to access another server or stuff like that.
So there is quite a list in 5 about what is not allowed, but Steve, maybe you could speak to that with a little more depth.
Or maybe just answer the question, given your knowledge of the technology, does this policy do everything that it says?
Good evening. Thank you. We do use this policy actually when we're having conversations with students. We use this policy when we feel like a student is trying to circumvent our network or trying to gain access through a proxy server and things like that. So I believe there is verbiage in there in the software. You can't use software. You can't try to willingly circumvent our network in order to access content that's not appropriate. And so I can't find the exact paragraph in here, but just perusing it again, but we've used it quite a bit. And
it's been effective.
And it's effective, right. I think the point is well taken about what happens when a student or someone does violate the acceptable use policy. And what we've been doing is working very closely with the building leaderships to have that discussion about this idea of a positive digital footprint. And so we're really trying to create an environment where we're not allowing students to make grave mistakes, but make mistakes where they're going to learn. And so some of the software that we've employed this year is actually now positively posting or notifying students when they've hit websites that are inappropriate or have tried to go through proxy servers and things like that. So again, this is an attempt, I think, to have parameters on what not to do, but also make that a learning opportunity so that we can hopefully educate the student on what to be doing in the future and make it an opportunity to learn from it.
So Steve, do we have access to, if a student has a Chromebook, for example, and they're renting that has information about how much of the time they're doing acceptable use on it versus playing games or do we have information that we can give back to either students or parents about how they're using their technology?
To a certain degree, it's not as finite as we'd like because, for instance, you could open up a web page that would be on YouTube and you could then leave that tab open and start working on your LMS and Schoology. But it's counting the fact that you had YouTube open. Mm-hmm. It does track how often you're on websites and how often. And we work with parents in the class that we deliver called Parenting in the Digital Age to show how they can track that information. On district Chromebooks, we do have top websites and how much time a site is accessed. It doesn't actually give us the length of time that it's accessed because that's not a very accurate metric on the internet.
Thank
you. Anything else? All right, moving on to our addition to reports and recommendations, which is item E, which is our school board communications and community engagement. And John and I are going to take this one. The board decided as one of our goals for the year was to explore different ways for the board to engage the community and get feedback. And we discussed a lot of different things. I think one of the things that can be frustrating as a board is we have very clear guidelines as to the rules that we have to operate under, and also then when we're doing a formal meeting like this evening, rules that we've set up for community input. But it can feel foreign and sometimes very cold, I think, to an audience member when you come up and you speak for 3 minutes and then you don't get immediate engagement back from the board. So we were talking about ideas, how can we change that? Because the fact is that the current system doesn't allow us necessarily to change what we're doing at this part of our meeting, our 7 o'clock meetings. And then work sessions, as we know, we don't generally have, we don't ever have public comment there. So we talked about a lot of different ways that we could try to engage the community in different ways. And if you look at the document that we have online, you'll see various options that we've used in the past, options that we're still exploring, like listening sessions and other formats. But we have committees, we have different ways of, doing, like when we did the K-5 study and the secondary study, we had options where people could come in and hear a presentation and go out to the halls and do post-it notes and different things and different ways that we could gather input. But we wanted to work on something this year, and so one of the things that we talked about was adding a half hour to this formal regular board meeting at 6:30 where parents and community members could write in a request to address the board and to have a less formal yet formal ability for the board and administration to actually respond back. And so what we'd like to try starting in December, because our November meeting won't work as we'll be at the Merit Scholars, National Merit Scholar presentation at 6 o'clock, which doesn't end until 7 and start at 7. But we'd like to propose that we provide a time at 6:30 where hopefully a week in advance, parents, community members can submit a question or a topic that they'd like to address the board. You'd still be given the opportunity to have your 3 minutes, but then there could be open dialogue back and forth, and it would allow administration particularly time to address those questions rather than on the spot, but with some time to give you the type of answers that you're looking for. So this is something we'd like to start in December. The details will be posted online, I'm sure, so that parents and community members can take a look at that and help give you guidelines as to how that will work. One of the other things that we decided of the group of things that we took a look at, and it was actually Dr. Schultz's idea.
Randy's not even laughing.
Sorry, Randy. Was something that he's done in the past, which is a superintendent's academy. And this would be something that I'm going to let Dr. Schultz talk about, but something that would help educate us as a community about all of these different areas, which can be very confusing. Just look at tonight, ADM, per pupil head count, actual enrollment. There's so many subjects in the education world that are hard to wrap our heads around. And so with a professional like this who's had all this experience, I think he can provide us an incredible service.
So I actually got this idea from a city manager, and Scott Neal is one of them that talked with the city managers to start us. They have a Citizens Academy in the city, so I thought, well, why we could have a Superintendent's Academy. So it really is a curriculum, if you will, that gives an opportunity for anybody who wants to be part of it to learn about the different aspects of the school district. School districts are incredibly and beautifully complex things. And you heard part of it tonight, and actually a small part of it tonight with regards to enrollment and how it impacts funding, how it impacts space, how it impacts class size. Those are all very complicated processes and systems that are managed in a school district. You heard about curriculum and the complexity of curriculum and the number of variables that play into it. So the Superintendent's Academy breaks it into 5 or 6 different evenings to interact with the professionals around that. And really, I usually start the academy off each time with what are the questions that you have. So you get those questions out. I think another one is just the operations of a school board and how school boards work and their role in the process of delivering curriculum and instruction. So it's exciting. It's a lot of fun too. So I enjoy doing it. Yeah, doing it as a series probably 5 once a month starting.
Wonderful. Any other board members have comments based on our discussions? We spoke about this in 2 work sessions, the 2nd and the 9th of October. We focused on this particular issue. All right. Well, with that, we will move on to our action agenda. The first action item tonight is the district financial audit, which has already been presented by Margot. But Margot, do you have any further detail or anything else you'd like to add before we take action on this?
No, I do not. Just I would ask for your approval and answer any additional questions that you have.
All right. Could I get a motion to accept the district financial audit for 2016-17? And any other additional questions or discussion?
I would then just again emphasize that we went over this in detail with the finance committee, with the city members and the community members, these recommendations.
And I'd just like to add my thanks to Margot and all of your team, because what we know is our financial management at Edina Public Schools has been consistently rated outstanding by outside agencies. We know that's no small task. We appreciate the complexity and do want to extend our thanks to you and your staff.
Yes, thank you, and especially with the amount of changes, not only from regulations, but also within your own staff. So thank you for your work on this. All right, then, since we have no further discussion or questions, could I get your vote for accepting the audit by saying aye, please? Aye. Opposed? Motion approved. All right, the next one is employee medical insurance review. Could I get a motion to approve the employee medical insurance contract effective January 1st, 2018? All right. Margot, could you fill us in on this one?
Attached in your board materials is a summary. Like last year, we were required to go out to bid for our health or medical district health medical insurance coverage. It's a two-year bid, and then we'll be required to go a year from now. At that time, the bid was included the second year a 10% rate cap, and so we always hope that it doesn't go to that, but at least there is a cap, and in this case, it was good we had a cap because otherwise, with the inflationary factors with health insurance right now and experience, it would have been higher than that 10%. So while we thrilled with a 10% increase, we are pleased that it is held at that dollar or that percentage amount for the district insurance. This is the teachers have voted to go cheap, so their increases are different. And we did, both Gwen and I met with insurance committee members and reviewed the information with them, as we always do, and open enrollment will be starting soon. The insurance committee is recommending that we review options for self-insurance so that, and part of that would be educating members on how that would work, and it might mean taking an additional premium increase in order to self-insure and self-fund, but what does the long-term look like overall in terms of future for medical insurance premiums, and if we can work on some education in that regard, the committee would like to do. Anything good? So, would answer any questions you have and ask for your approval. And again, it did go through insurance committee.
Margot, at one point we had a number out there of the loan or temporary funding we'd need to start self-insurance. Do we have a current number for that?
We did not. I think that was about 3 or 4 years ago, so I don't even want to quote it at this time. So I would want to get a new number. We didn't have numbers presented to us at this time. And what we will do, would like to do with the bid next year is not only bid it, but bid an option for self-insurance and have that comparison. What would that be like? And what does that do to the premiums? If we're going to generate those reserves on premium only, is there some borrowing of sorts so we get cash flows? How does that work?
Thanks.
This was also reviewed in Finance Committee as well. And I just thought I'd point out that although the percent of the cost of insurance is going up 10%, the way that most of our contracts are structured, we already have a set amount that the district provides towards our employees' benefit packages. Is that correct?
Correct. For the settled contracts, we already have a defined.
All right. Any further questions or discussions? All right. Seeing none, could I get a motion to approve the employee medical insurance? Excuse me. All those in favor of approving? Sorry. All those in favor of approving the employee medical insurance contract effective January 1st, 2018, say aye. Opposed? Motion approved. All right, our next one is the superintendent performance goals. Could I get a motion to approve Dr. Schultz's performance goals for the 2017-18 school year? Any further discussion on this? This was brought to us as a discussion item last month. I know that several times the board has discussed this as well. And Dr. Schultz, I don't know if you'd like to comment at all.
It was brought to the Clerk committee as well as in work session. take any questions.
You know, we had this as a discussion last month, so, and there's been no changes since. All right, hearing no further discussion, all those in favor of approving the performance goals, say aye. Opposed? Motion approved. All right, on to information and announcements. Anything that anybody has that they'd like to discuss, committee report? John, would you like to give any kind of an update?
I think I only would add that 287 committee report that Regina provided is there for you, both public. And as far as just update, referendum information sessions are going very well. We're doing did our 47th presentation, so we are finishing that up a little bit next week.
And there's a public forum tomorrow evening at 7 o'clock, correct, at the high school?
Correct.
For anybody in the community who'd like further information on the upcoming operating levy. We do have some staff recognitions that I'd like to point out. There was a commendation for Paul Kyle and Andrew Richter, both band directors at the high school. Just thanking them for fostering so much learning and development that is clearly shown as our kids leave our system and move on to higher education and other places where they can use their band skills. Another commendation was for Peter West, who's a 5th grade teacher at Creek Valley. In an email to the principal there, a parent was sharing how well, she was sharing the fact that she noticed in her student their impeccable skills in keeping notes and basically staying on top of their work at school. And when asked, the child said, well, that's because Mr. West taught me how to take Purnell notes, which I thought was just delightful. So commendation to him. Also to Troy Stein from the Edina Athletic Booster Club, just commending him on being a dedicated, sharp leader. And lastly, our Jeff Jorgensen, who is the Director of Student Support Services, and Leah Ellis, who is a Concord elementary teacher who works with our children with autism, and a parent had specifically commended both of them for the incredible experience that their child is receiving in the district, not only Jeff's guidance, but also the teacher's individual work with their students. So we wanted to just point those out, and again, just to recognize all of our staff in the district for their dedication to our kids and the work that they do, and of course the administration for the support that they give and the direction that they give to all of the staff in the district and teachers. So thank you to everyone. If there's anything else this evening, then seeing that we've concluded our agenda, could I get a motion to adjourn? All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? We are adjourned. 1 minute off. Oh, she's joking that. No, she's saying that it's actually 9 o'clock. We did go over.
I see.